Good morning, everyone. Dr. Jen from Wellness in Two Words here, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. I appreciate all the support, and I'm sorry it's been a bit since I've done my last video, but I really have to say I've been down like 1,000 rabbit holes trying to research and educate myself about coronavirus and coronaviruses and the particular situation of COVID-19, which is the disease caused by SARS-CoV-2, the new or novel coronavirus that is really giving humanity a problem right now. So with all those rabbit holes, and then also just trying to work from home and be a mom and a wife, I've just really, I've really had a big, I'm not gonna lie, struggled this week. And I'm sure everyone else is struggling just the same with fear, anxiety, anticipatory grief, questions, just trying to navigate the unknown. So now that I've had some time to kind of go through some of the literature, educate myself about, what I consider reputable resources, I kind of want to do a recap and then let you know kind of where my head is at on this particular situation. So let's get forward because there's a glare. Okay. My 2-word phrase for today, wellness in 2 words, is be vigilant. I don't know if any of you saw Andrew Cuomo's, one of his most recent addresses, but one of the things he said in this is, this isn't a sprint, this is a marathon. We are going to have to be in this for weeks, if not months. And trying to figure out what our new normal is going to be the challenge. So my video flavor for this is to be vigilant, because we can't relax. We've seen already just in the past few days what's happened when China's relaxed, although we have to question how much their data is accurate. But even when you look at current mortality rates, well, I'm not going to say mortality, case fatality rates for this illness in other countries, we still got a long way to go. So let me just kind of recap some things, and I hope you find this information interesting and or informative and helpful. And if you want to try to send me some questions, I will do my best to answer them. I've gone down a lot of side streets on this, and so there's a lot more information for us to learn. So remember, this is a novel virus. It's new to humans. They did sequencing of it when they identified the strain in China and found out that it was a previously not yet seen strain of RNA virus. To kind of remind you the structure of the virus, and I'll show a little picture here. The things that kind of help me think about it in terms of how it looks like this, right? On the electron microscope, super high detail, they can tell a lot about it. But it is it's basically a bubble, if that helps you kind of think about stuff. So it's a bubble with proteins embedded in it, just like all of our cells are kind of like bubbles that hold fluid, but they're far more complex than that. But they hold fluid and they have proteins embedded in them. So it is an envelope virus. So that envelope is how it attacks our cells, because it has these proteins embedded in there. So think about like a semi-rigid bubble. You've seen those sticky bubbles, right, that kids have that you can blow and they're like stickier than normal. Think of it like that. And so we're able to pop it. So that's to our advantage. It's not a naked virus. It's not super duper persistent. It is subject to things that can kill it. So that's in our favor. So those proteins that are suspended in that bubble are how it attaches to your cells and then kind of puts them all together. My dog doesn't know social distancing, so here comes Monty with his little friend Sarah. But anyway, so that bubble with those proteins in it is how it attaches to your cell and then hijacks your machinery and then starts to make more copies of itself. So knowing that you can pop the bubble is an advantage. So, and I'll kind of skip down here in my little presentation here about things that kill it. So we know heat kills it. Heat can rupture those membranes or disrupt that phospholipid bilayer. We know that bleach can do that. We know that alcohol can do that. We know that peroxide can do that. Ether and chloroform, which most of us don't have that hanging around our house. Paracetic acid, which is used in the food industry to basically not sterilized, but just wash down produce and those kind of things, in large factories is helpful. pH is helpful. Heat. So when I say pH, I'm talking about acidic pH. So in your GI tract, if you have a healthy stomach and you have adequate gastric acid, survivability of this virus in your GI tract is low. Now, if you're on a proton pump inhibitor, that may be different. Heat and then UV light. So there are a lot of ways that we can kill this virus. That's a good thing. So that is helpful to me to know that when it comes to lowering transmission, you're cleaning your surfaces, you're not touching your face, you're washing your hands, you're using the soaps. All of those things are helpful to know that you can protect yourself. And I think that's very empowering. And keep in mind, the whole purpose of me doing these videos is to be helpful, encouraging, and I think information and knowledge is power. And when you're in the dark, it's really hard to make responsible decisions. When you have information, then you are empowered to make decisions that you feel are good for you. I'm not going to tell you what decision to make for yourself. I'm not going to make any recommendations. I'm merely sharing information to help you because I'm not your doctor. But I am a doctor who's trying to make sense of this whole mess. So I'll just be humble and say that off the bat. Okay, so when you think about the virus and how it kind of hijacks your machinery, I was like, it's kind of like if you went into a Kinko's and you said, you know what, we're not going to do anything else other than make copies of this one thing, right? And we're going to package it in these little envelopes and we're going to send it out everywhere and we're just going to go to other Kinko's and make more copies. And that's the only thing we're going to do, which means your vital functions of your cells are hijacked as well. And then ultimately it kills the cell. But it also has this ability to kind of like hijack other cells that are nearby without having to, it kind of puts them in this like big conglomeration. It's kind of like if you had a pirate ship and you're going to invade a yacht and then you turn around and you just kind of lash more boats together. So you just hop on from boat to boat to boat rather than actually having to dock and, like make a hole in the hole with a docking protein. I don't know if that's an interesting analogy, but so it's super effective in doing that and hijacking neighboring cells, which enhances its ability to make you sick. One good thing, though, is when they've looked at the sequencing of this that I've discovered in a lot of the sources is there's a lot of conservation of its genomic sequencing. So what that means is it doesn't change very much. It doesn't have a lot of mutagenic capability right now. It's got plenty of available hosts it doesn't need. It doesn't have pressures to mutate to survive. So conservation of those proteins and gene sequences is going to be super important when you look at making a vaccine. That impacts drug therapy because if those proteins stay the same, then the drug is going to consistently act a certain way. That also impacts vaccine formation because if the proteins again are conserved, then your target doesn't shift very much. So that's good. Okay, so testing and density control are the two main things that we have to work against right now until we have more information on drug trials and more information on vaccine formation. So where we are with testing, I have to admit this isn't super transparent for me because I'm trying to, watch media and news outlets and try to figure out where we are with that. So let's just look at the definitions of testing to begin with. Prevalence of a disease is the total number of cases at a given point in time. So if you said today, how many cases are there of coronavirus infection, COVID-19? So that's your prevalence. I try to find a good place for a video, and it's really hard when you're working from home. So incidence is the total number of new cases. So if you're looking at prevalence, that's how many cases are out there right now. Incidence is about the number of new cases. And unfortunately, that's the thing we have to track with the testing and the nucleic acid assays, because those are real-time reverse transcriptase PCR tests. They test for virus. They test for virus in your nose right now. They don't test for whether or not you had the disease before, and they're not predictive. They're not going to predict whether or not you're going to get the disease. No test can really do that except for, like genetic markers for cancer and those kind of things. So understand that testing is limited because it's this point in time today, do you have the virus? And so as we detect and we test more of the the sick people, then we're going to find a higher incidence. So we will have more new cases. That's going to be a given. And a lot of people are making the argument of, well, I think this has been around for a while. And so I think the testing, where it's going to impact mortality rate. And yes, it will. As you have more and more and more cases out there, and as time goes on, mortality in theory would fall because your numerator denominator equation changes. However, I would argue if this has been around for a while, why haven't we seen such a huge spike in mortality before now? Right? If this has been around in the States since December, where are all the people who are dying from it before? I would wager that this is still new on United States soil, and we're still early in a pandemic potential of it causing a lot of damage to our health and our population. So I think as we start to see more and more and more deaths climb, that's where we're going to know if we're making any impact, if we have fewer deaths on a daily basis. And that's a sad, sad fact. But incidence will increase because we're testing more, period. We're going to have more positives. And we're focusing on a sick population. Keep in mind, we're not just doing a random cross-section of people who are well and out and active and are you positive for the virus, because we need to conserve the test for the sick people so we can really, really, truly see what the case fatality rate is. That's the number of people who die of the number of identified cases that are out there. So testing is key. Keep in mind the number that you see doubles every 7 days because of how well this virus transmits, how consistently it spreads. Testing is only good if you have a specific and sensitive test. You don't want false negatives, because if you have a false negative, people will think, oh, I'm good, and I have the virus, and they'll go out and they're not going to socially distance the way they should be doing, and that would change their behavior. I mean, humans are just, we're awful. Our behavior is so irrational at times. I mean, it's just, so if you went and swabbed somebody today and they're like, oh yeah, good, I don't have the virus, and go out and do something crazy, like get into a crowd of people, that doesn't mean they're not going to get the virus in 3 days. And what if your test is negative and you actually have the virus and then you're shedding it to people? That's even worse. So a test has to be really good and very specific and very sensitive. So it has to consistently capture the presence of the virus, and it has to be very specific in saying, if you have it, you have it. If you don't, you don't. So keep in mind limitations of the test. Now, right now, Abbott recently, I think it was just yesterday or day before, put out that they're going to have a point of care rapid testing that'll have a result within, I think, like 10 minutes or something. Definitely not a turnaround time of 2 or 3 days, including, backlog. And a lot of private labs have been encouraged to do this. The FDA has encouraged them to do that and relaxed a lot of the restrictions on the, I guess, quality control. Well, not quality control, but just the whole accreditation of that. So as of today, unfortunately, with the testing that we currently have, and we're only testing ill patients, the global case fatality rate, which is you have number of deaths divided by the number of cases identified, is 4.6%. And there are a lot of people who are ill, who are in limbo, that haven't declared whether or not they're going to recover or die. Not the most encouraging data. Italy's case fatality rate is 10.6% as of this morning. The US is 1.6%, but keep in mind, we're new in the curve. We're lagging behind Italy. So those are things that I think we all have to really just keep in mind. Social distancing is going to be very important, because Italy, yes, they have an older population, but they also had a huge spike, a huge apex, and they couldn't accommodate all of the sick people at one time. So the whole concept of flattening the curve has not changed with the data. It remains the same. It remains the same to protect the people that you love, to protect your community. Don't be a jerk. Don't run around and be like, oh, well, I'm young, it's fine, I won't get the disease. Really? Really? Because when you have your appendicitis, when you have a broken foot, when you have any of those things, you're then putting yourself at risk, because you're going to go into a hospital where there's a really higher concentration of people who are sick. And you're potentially then going to take that back to someone that you love. So it's not about you. And I said that in the last video, but it still remains. It is not about you. And trust me, it sucks. None of us asked for this. I remember once I had a patient in the ER. He was a young type 1 diabetic, and he's just super non-compliant. I get it. Pizza tastes great. French fries. Yeah, whatever. So It's hard. It's hard. It is hard to have a disease that you did not ask for, right? We did not ask for a pandemic. We were long overdue for it, honestly, because of population density and all of the things that we do in the world that are not okay with how we treat nature. But we didn't ask for this, but I think the measure of your character determines on how you handle it, because you can either ignore it and do things that are reckless, or you can buck up and actually do the things that you have to do. So, I'm sorry to get preachy. So keep in mind that what you see is not a true mortality rate. The true mortality rate will happen over time as we identify more cases within the population and we identify more people who were asymptomatic and recovered. And a lot of that will also be determined by serology testing, where we draw a blood sample to see, did you make antibodies against it because you were exposed to it and you survived, right? Serology testing will probably be the biggest key for us to understand true mortality. And keep in mind, as the type of test changes, then you can't really compare one to the other, right? That's apples to oranges. A real-time PCR RNA test is not the same as an antigen test, which just checks for a certain protein that's kind of typical for that virus, versus a serology test, which tells me you had it and you recovered. So let's just use the example of when people start to get vaccinated and they have the MMR, and that's measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. I'm a healthcare provider. I've had that as a child, and I've had boosters. And if you look at a titer, if you were to draw my blood today and say how many antibodies are present just circulating around in my body for MMR, for any of those three that are in that vaccine, that will tell you how robust my immunity for it is. A great way to test that too would be to get a booster and then measure my response a few weeks later and be like, oh yeah, she's totally fine. She can fight this off. Ultimately, that will be the goal with a vaccine, to say, if you're vaccinated, do you have an adequate response? And then we can say we'll give it to lots of people throughout the country. And of course, they'll prioritize healthcare workers, military, those kind of situations first, rather than just a general population, because those people could be vectors, right? That's why they always want people in the hospital to get a flu shot, because if I get a flu shot, then I will be less likely to transmit it to everyone I'm in contact with, if indeed it gives me protection. Same thing. Once we get a coronavirus, a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, everybody you're in contact with who has been vaccinated is much less likely to transmit it to you, because their system gets it under control really quickly. So rapid point-of-care testing on the way. Limitations of those tests are there. It's not predictive. It's not going to predict, are you going to get the disease, because just because you test negative doesn't mean you can't get it in a week with an exposure. And serology testing will be the key to let us know really how much protection we have, mortality, preventing mortality down the road. Okay, so where we are right now as a country is, let's explain some epidemiology concepts. First of all, we talked about incidence and prevalence and case fatality rate, which are the things that we can really only track right now because we're super early still in where we are in our curve. And we don't know how long it's been around in the States, although I still think we're young in it. And we don't know who all has it and who's had it and recovered. So those things have yet to be determined. However, we're now there are different phases of a pandemic to look at. There's containment and there's mitigation. And when you look at containment, I was like, just think of if you had beads in a jar, and they're in the jar, they're contained. They're not, you control it, you control the lid, you control where those beads go. That is containment, when you actually have limitations of where something spreads. If you take the lid off and then they go everywhere, mitigation becomes how far they spread and whether or not how much damage they could cause. So say they're sticky beads and you all over the floor, those sticky beads go everywhere. How much of the sticky is everywhere? Mitigation is preventing the amount of sticky, if that makes any sense. I don't think that's the best analogy, but mitigation means you limit the damage. So we're no longer in containment in the United States. We're trying with social distancing to contain it, but we're actually in the mitigation phase of this epidemiological, I can't even talk, epidemiological mess. So mitigation means that with social distancing, we can at least minimize the damage because we minimize the number of new cases. And as we impact the number of new cases, we minimize the damage to the people who are sick, if that makes any sense. That means reducing hospital inflow by having fewer cases. That means ramping up the resources to care for the sick people, which is the whole thing that Andrew Cuomo was talking about, inventory and capacity, hospital capacity for things that we need to keep people alive. And keep in mind, we're still learning more about the actual disease process and the timeline for patients as to when care becomes futile, when it's no longer helpful, and whether or not we need to go ahead and just withdraw care and help the next person. So that's a really horrible place to be as a healthcare provider, because we have those conversations with families. I mean, I've had those conversations in hospice. I've had those many times in the emergency room about trying to predict how someone's going to do. And it's not an easy thing, but I think when you have so many people that need care, you really have to think about the next person in line. And I can't even imagine some of the ER physicians who are having to have those conversations, not once, twice a day, but 20 times a day. That would be a really difficult thing. So my prayers go out to all the colleagues that are on the front lines in these epicenters, because those are decisions we feel like we shouldn't be making, although we often do. But to do them at that magnitude and that frequency is really stressful for healthcare providers. So just prayers for all of them. Okay, so reduce the amount of inflow of people, increase hospital capacity till we get this under control. And that's where you can impact your case fatality rate within the United States. What's interesting to me is I haven't seen as many healthcare outlets before on the internet that actually encourage people to stay home. So when you go and if you're to Google, whatever advice for flu or all that kind of stuff, if you go and Google that, typically you see if you feel sick or if you, then you need to reach out to your doctor or go to the nearest ER or whatever. What we've seen is actually a reverse of that, where they say don't go to the hospital unless you absolutely can't breathe, which I find so fascinating and surreal as a provider. Most people look at it from a litigation standpoint or a liability standpoint and say, oh, well, if there's any doubt, you need to go to the hospital. And what we're seeing is complete different dialogue where people are saying, you only need to come to the hospital if you truly cannot breathe. And I have to say, I 100% agree with that statement. Just because you put yourself at risk, you put your family members at risk. If you can deal with it at home, please try to deal with it at home. Granted, you're still going to have your other normal illnesses like heart attacks and appendicitis and all these other things, but really those no longer become elective treatment, they become emergent treatment. So if you can take care of yourself at home safely, do so. And one thing about that too is the whole study in Germany about ibuprofen. I have yet to find that paper and break that down and look at that. So there's some question about whether ibuprofen can actually be less helpful and could be more dangerous. I can't answer that right now. But what I would say is that your immune response is there for a reason. So running a fever, people seem to be very intolerant of a fever. Lots of people come to the ER for a fever of 103, 102. And if it's a viral syndrome, I'm like, run the fever. Unless you're at risk for a febrile seizure, unless you're at risk for something that your body can't tolerate a fever of 102, run the fever. If you can't tolerate the fever because of discomfort or because of metabolic stress, that kind of thing, heart rate's too high, then take Tylenol. That's probably the going advice for right now. But if you can run the fever safely, please do so, because that will help you fight off virus. You want to make your whole body less hospitable for the invasion of a virus. And I will say this too, never before in my career have I worried about my safety as a provider. I've pretty robust immune system, tend to not get sick very much. Obviously, I do the things that I can to support my system. But this is a game changer for a lot of people who are engaging patients in patient care, because really I've never looked at a patient as they could infect me with something that could be deadly. So that's different when you look at people who are from the CDC who do the containment type stuff. They're used to that, but it's still a stressor. So keep in mind all your healthcare workers, nurses, CNAs, first responders, doctors. We're viewing people in a completely different headspace, and that's really, really stressful. So just extra prayers and thoughts for them, because it's easy to rush into a mass casualty, well, it's not easy, but to rush into a mass casualty situation with the thing of, I'm going to do my very best for every single person here, and I will work to the point of exhaustion if that's what it takes. But it's different when you know that you actually could die from it. So, public health versus economic health. This is another thing that Cuomo said in his address, which I thought was very good. There is a balance between the two. But last I checked, your economic health doesn't really matter if you're not alive to enjoy it. So I come from the standpoint of public health to me is much more important than economic health. But keep in mind, the longer that this drags out, the more the toll it's going to take on our economy, right? We know this because there are a lot of businesses that depend on interpersonal contact, person-to-person contact, understood. I think what's encouraging to me is that a lot of businesses are trying to be very nimble, and they're trying to meet people's needs safely and try to stay afloat. So I think anything that you can do to help small businesses in your community to help keep them viable is huge. And so one thing that we're doing is we're getting a lot of takeout. We're also, I'm going to, this week, my initiative is I was trying to get all this research done. My next initiative is going to be to try to do gift cards, give good tips when we do takeout, that kind of thing. So keep in mind the businesses that really need people, there are a lot of people that are insulated from that. People who do landscaping and yard work. You don't have to have a lot of person-to-person contact. You can be outdoors. So really, one thing that we could minimize the economic toll is if we focus on those businesses we know depend on people, like in-person people, and really, really wrap your arms around those businesses and try to support them in any way that you possibly can, I think would be collectively just one of the biggest things that we could do, because small business is still the backbone of America, and we need those businesses to stay open. So we talked about how to destroy it. What we're doing on a daily basis at home, it's and this is where I probably struggled the most this week, is the social distancing is hard. If you care about your people and your community, your neighbors, all the people that I love, I remind myself the reason why we're being so vigilant about our social distancing is because I don't want to get them sick. They don't want to get me sick. I had a really bad day yesterday and went outside for a walk and could still talk to neighbors, and it was so uplifting to talk to them and just share that I wasn't in a good place and know that they were rooting for me. And I was like, look, we're down to 5 rolls of toilet paper. And they're like, we got your back. We got your toilet paper. And I was like, okay. But I think just remember, we can depend on each other, even though it's from distance. The people who their love language is quality time and touch, I can imagine you're taking a hit. So I think any way that we can love on each other and support each other is huge. So what we're doing is we're doing our social distancing. We're washing our hands. I've ordered my Young Living products come via direct sales, so they come straight to the house. I've got their hand soap. I've got their surface cleaners, all the supplements, all that kind of stuff. We're trying to do probiotics every day because keeping your gut health is important for so many things, for generating short-chain fatty acids in your intestines when you break down fiber, which keeps the integrity of your gut epithelium okay. It actually helps reinforce your blood-brain barrier. So there's just so many things that we do. So distancing, hand washing, surface cleaning, decontamination, I'm diffusing essential oils, antioxidants, supplements, probiotics, taking vitamins, vitamin C, and vitamin D are important. Let's see, a keto diet. Keto diet with some intermittent fasting. We're definitely trying to do the vegetable fiber. You can do that with frozen foods too. That just helps adequate sleep. That's been the one that I've struggled with the most because I've been up at night researching and my mind just keeps going. So I've had to use some essential oils to help me relax and sleep. Adequate sleep is one of the strongest things you can do to keep your immune system at its peak. And then I said ordering out, supporting local businesses. We're avoiding sugar. I'm avoiding alcohol. Although I did have a takeout margarita, but hey, whatever. Okay, so to recap, when it comes to symptoms of the disease, so if you get a respiratory infection and you're concerned you have COVID, the going party line is to stay home. If you are sufficiently symptomatic and you have access to drive-by testing or drive-through testing, then definitely consider that, because it is important for us to be tracking people who are sick. You should be self-quarantining for sure, but also just for us to know in terms of prevalence within your community. One thing that has been interesting that has come out of this, and I've noticed this in the ER group that I'm in, the Facebook group that I'm in, as well as now it's becoming more common knowledge. A lot of patients are relating that they get anosmia and dysgeusia. So those are fancy medical terms for can't smell and altered taste. So hey there, I'm back. Sorry, had a little phone call interruption there. So I was talking about symptoms consistent with COVID. And one of the things that, there's this glare I can't get rid of. Anyway, one of the things that we noticed is altered taste and loss of smell. And some of the understanding of that, it could be that as the disease enters through the nasal passages, your olfactory nerve, which is one of your cranial nerves, goes straight into the brain. It's like an express lane straight into your brain. And so there's concern that maybe, and we don't understand this, there will be more knowledge that comes, but could it be that those cells are damaged with the infection, or do they undergo what's called apoptosis, where they kind of sacrifice themselves so that they can't spread more infection? We don't really know yet, but knowing that your olfactory nerve, when you smell it, goes straight to your brain. I mean, that's why it's linked to your limbic system and memory, and that's why smell is so profound. That's why it's important. It means boiled milk makes you go, probably shouldn't drink that. That might get me sick. It's very important for survivability. So having that intact sense of smell, how much of that is involved from the actual virus damaging those nerves versus is it trying to track into your central nervous system? And then there's even been questions of how much of it goes to your brain stem and is involved in your ventilation drive. So we don't know. This is all brand new. These are all new questions, but knowing that that seems to be a common thread in symptoms of patients is that they kind of have an altered taste and they kind of lose their sense of smell. Could be a warning sign that you need to go ahead and quarantine and really protect the people around you. I'll be sniffing my oils. The day I can't smell them, I'm going to go, So anyway, let's see. And that was actually something they found in, there was a study with mice, but you can't exactly ask mice if they lost their sense of smell. I mean, I guess you could try to test that, but anyway. So duration 5 to 14 days. It seems to possibly affect men more than women. Self-quarantining is key. And what actually kind of helped me kind of come off the ledge a little bit on this as a provider to try to figure out all this stuff is that I was watching a video from a critical care intensivist who is in New York. And then also there's a paper that kind of also correlates with this, is they found, looking not only at active patients now, but also looking in China and other countries, that sustained contact with someone who has it or someone who is early infectious 1 or 2 days before symptoms is probably the most likely method of transmission. You're looking at, healthcare providers, family members, and people that you have really fairly close contact with. It's not going to be super casual. So that freaking out about going to the grocery store, that kind of helped me out a little bit. I was like, where is it and where is it going? Knowing that we can affect the chain of transmission by the certain things that we do is empowering to me and helped me kind of relax a little bit about, not relax about what I'm doing, but just relax mentally and be less stressed. But keep in mind, we're going to be distancing for months because we've seen already in China a little uptick in cases, and that's because as they relax those restrictions, there will be a new wave. The question is, how high is the peak, and how much mitigation will you need if it gets out of control. But do keep in mind, if your circle is small, then the number of people that you have to notify or watch or restrict contact with is small. So that actually helps us limit spread. So even if it's just our immediate family that we're socially distancing with and we're not seeing extended family and we're waving at neighbors, I think that helps just know that if one of us were to get sick, then we know that we're not going to give it to someone else. And again, that will play out over time as more people are exposed to it, more people get immunity to it, then you can be a little calmer. So when to go to the hospital is when you cannot breathe, period. Like when you feel you cannot breathe. And a lot of people will have some mild hypoxemia and not really, they may feel some tightness in their chest and then they've got low oxygen, but they really don't. So when you feel dyspneic, you need to go for help, because that's meaning you're probably going to need intervention, and don't wait. Otherwise, if you just have a fever, you feel achy, you have a cough, you feel kind of miserable, stay home, quarantine, treat your symptoms, go to the hospital when you feel like you can't breathe, because that's when intervention will be key. There's no active treatment yet right now. There's all it is supportive care. And that's what doctors can help with and nurses can help with. Like I said, run the fever if possible. Now, recent drug trials. So when you're new in a disease like this, obviously there's a lot of information out there. Chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine were mentioned as potential drugs to help. So I certainly applaud using any of these drugs if they work and if they're safe. The problem is when you have such small sample size, and that study was flawed in the sense that it was super small, and it's all anecdotal evidence. So just because I say it kind of worked doesn't mean that it definitely works. Understand those medications like azithromycin, which is the component of a Z-Pak, or hydroxychloroquine, which is Plaquenil. A lot of people use it for immunosuppressive diseases. Well, for autoimmune diseases like lupus. First of all, if we get too crazy with it, there will be a shortage for the people who actively really need it. So if we're going to say it works and we're going to start prescribing it for it, we need to be sure it works. So what they're trying to do right now is do what's called a randomized controlled drug trial, where you have no bias inserted, where you just pick people to go in this group or that group or this group, and you control for all these things as much as possible, and you try not to influence the outcome of the study. And then they monitor on a active basis. If they see a huge statistically significant difference in outcomes early on, they stop the study, and then they say it's statistically significant, and that changes and impacts therapy. They don't continue that study when people are failing just to be sure. Like, they'll notice if there's a statistical difference in one medication regimen versus another, and if they know that it has a huge impact on mortality in terms of helping people, then they'll stop the study early and then institute it as a mainstay of treatment. When you put chloroquine together with Zithromax, there are issues that it can impact your heart rhythm. It can do what's called QT prolongation. People can get bad side effects, not just nausea and vomiting. We're talking about permanent hearing loss, vision disturbances, those kind of things. So I know a lot of people are like, man, if I get COVID, I want chloroquine. Understood. And there's a lot of that out there that is being perpetuated by the media. And even our president was, but Fauci was like, no. We need to understand that you don't want the cure to be worse than the disease, because there's still a chance that you may do well and you don't need any drug therapy at all. And one of the things that I found in going back and looking through a bunch of this research too is that there are other you don't want to get tunnel vision on just one medication regimen. You want to consider many different things. And when they look at the structure of these proteins and how you can interfere with the proteins and basically intercept them before they can bind to the cell, they actually know their biochemical structure. They know how these proteins are folding. They're learning more about it every day. So we can figure out what thing can kind of interfere with that receptor on a biochemical basis. There was I found an old study about Thorazine, which is like an old schizophrenic, well, it's not old, but it's less commonly used schizophrenic drug. Now, it has side effects. It can cause something called neuroleptic malignant syndrome. It can cause tardive dyskinesia. There are other things about it that are not ideal, but if we use it short term for a patient, knowing that it can interfere with infection of the virus on the receptor site, then it might be an option. But if everybody's focusing on chloroquine and they're not focusing on Thorazine, then we might miss out on another viable therapy. So I'm just saying, When it comes to drug trials, we're going to learn more. People are aggressively all over the globe trying to figure out how to do this as it plays out. They want to help people, but you can't rush to just one drug or another and neglect other possible things. And you have to make sure it's safe for patients, because you don't want to have permanent hearing loss from taking a drug that you didn't even need in the first place, right? Or that it turned out it didn't help. Like, that would suck. So keep in mind, that's that narrow therapeutic index, that it doesn't take too much to take it out of the window of helping to actually hurting. That's what that means. Okay, so a lot of questions that we ask each other as practitioners, like, is this going to help? Is this going to make things worse? Would they live without it? We don't know yet. So one of the big things that is a problem with this disease when people really get into trouble, and why they typically are going to die from it, is what's called acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. So we don't understand fully why some people get what's called cytokine storm, which is this wave of inflammation throughout their system that basically causes more damage than good. That's one thing if you have your immune system is like, I got this, it's going to send out all these little chemical markers, and your cells are going to take things out of circulation that shouldn't be there. It's another if it just goes crazy and it's like, and just starts to cause more harm than good, like damaging healthy cells. And one of the things it can do is in the lung, the cells that line the lining of your lungs. So think of a sponge. Think of your lung as this big inflatable sponge. All these little air holes that are in there, and it's important. And every time you breathe, it stretches and then it closes back down. Stretches and closes back down. So when you get to the point where those pockets fill with fluid, imagine trying to push air through a wet sponge. It doesn't work. So as those cells get damaged, the lining of them gets damaged, then you basically can't get oxygen into your bloodstream. And that's what acute respiratory distress syndrome is. And that's when people are really struggling. So obviously, ventilators are what we try to do to help with that. We put people on what's called positive pressure ventilation, where we actually use force to kind of push more oxygen into their bloodstream. And what we're finding is people who really die from this disease you can't oxygenate them under any circumstances, which is really terrible. So lastly, vaccine questions. So questions about a vaccine. Again, I talked about it. I said you want it to be safe. You want it to be effective. There are different ways to formulate vaccines. You attach it to a molecule that kind of gets your immune system to notice it. And the bigger it is, the more it helps. But you don't want it to trigger too much of an immune response, like anaphylaxis. So there are adjuvants that you add to it to get your immune system to go, look over here, look over here. But then you also want to do either heat killed or just the protein that's there. So, there are different types of viruses, the ones that are actually killed versus live viruses. The live viruses we don't want to cause disease. So how they're going to figure out the best way to formulate this vaccine is just going to determine what they learn. But keep in mind that testing is 12 to 18 months before we would have a viable vaccine, which is why we have to distance ourselves to create time. We just need time. And I was really struggling with that, but I understand that there are people all over the globe that are all over this, and they're doing everything they can to try to research it and learn more about it. And so that's the power of people. So if we do our job in terms of lowering transmission and limiting transmission, that gives them time to do their job, which is to help find a global solution for this disease in terms of preventing future infections. So do what you can. You can do it. So I'm going to end with a quote from Andrew Cuomo, and I have a different video I'm going to do about staying connected. That's my next one. And I'm really practicing a lot more gratitude about that. So Andrew Cuomo said, "This isn't a sprint, this is a marathon," and he is true when he says that, or he is correct when he says that. And then another quote he had from that address was, "This situation is not easy, but easy times don't forge character. Hard times do." So I know we can do the hard things. We just have to support each other, look for ways to help each other. And when it's all done, we can have a really big hug, have a big group hug. So I'm more encouraged now than I was last week, and I'm sorry it took so long to get another video out, but I will do my best to kind of keep you apprised as I learn more about this disease and track more of the science and the media about it. So stay home, stay well, and see you next time. Enjoy this beautiful day.